There is this really bold, almost aggressive claim that has been floating around academic and scientific circles for a while now.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a growing sentiment.
Right. And the claim is basically, this philosophy is dead and modern science is the thing that killed it.
Yeah, that's the big argument.
I mean, if you love to learn, you've probably wondered about this yourself. The argument suggests that in an age where we have, functional MRI machines literally watching our brains think and massive telescopes photographing the birth of galaxies.
Like the James Webb.
Exactly. With all that hard data, ancient philosophy just seems, well, obsolete, like a relic from before we had actual tools to measure things.
It is the definition of an existential crisis for the humanities, honestly, because it forces us to look at the very foundation of how we acquire knowledge. I mean, if science can measure absolutely everything, what is the actual point of philosophy?
And that specific tension is exactly the focus of today's deep dive. We are digging into some really fascinating source material today. Specifically, we're looking at Chapter 1 of the book Philosophical Essays.
By the philosopher Abdul Jabbar Al-Waily.
Yeah. And that first chapter is titled Defense of Philosophy. It's essentially a direct, very pointed response to an article that was published in the Al-Qadisiyah newspaper by a writer named Khazal al-Majidi.
Right, and just to give some context on al-Majidi's core argument in that article, he basically claimed that 20th century science orchestrated almost like a corporate buyout of philosophy's traditional territories.
Oh, I like that framing. A corporate buyout.
Yeah, because think about it. Physics took over ontology, the study of existence. Modern astronomy took over epistemology, or how we know things. And sciences like psychology and anthropology completely took over human nature.
So to al-Majidi, metaphysics is just facing total extinction.
Exactly. Because in his view, there was simply no unmapped territory left for the philosopher to explore. The scientists have claimed it all.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because al-Waili systematically dismantles that claim. He argues that science and philosophy aren't in competition at all.
No, not even a little bit.
Right, because they're fundamentally performing two entirely different functions. And to understand why al-Waili says science hasn't replaced philosophy, let's look at a really tangible example he uses in the text, the apple test.
Ah, yes. The apple test is brilliant.
It really is. So imagine I'm holding an apple. Modern science has a very specific, mechanistic way of explaining my experience of holding and looking at this apple.
Right, so if you ask a physicist to explain the redness of that apple, they don't talk about beauty or essence. They look at the mechanics. They'll tell you the color is just a specific wavelength of light bouncing off the skin of the fruit and hitting the retina of your eye.
Okay, so the physicist handles the light, but then what?
Then the physiologist takes over. They explain how those light waves trigger this really complex sequence of nerve interactions. Electrical signals travel up your neural pathways and essentially create a physical disturbance in your brain.
Right.
And then your brain translates that disturbance into your subjective experience of, red, or the sweetness of the taste, or the smoothness of the skin.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Yeah.
If the physiologist can map the exact electrical impulse from my tongue all the way to my visual cortex, haven't they literally found the physical address of the taste and the color?
You would think so, yeah.
Right, like we have the literal blueprints of the interaction. It seems like the mystery is solved. Why do we need a philosopher to overcomplicate my snack?
Well, what's fascinating here is al-Waili's counterstrike. Science brilliantly maps the mechanism of perception. There's no denying that. But al-Waili points out that it completely sidesteps the ultimate question of reality.
How so?
Because science relies on the premise that your brain is translating external stimuli into an internal experience. But if your brain is the entity doing all the translating,
right,
if it is generating the colors and the smells and the textures entirely within a dark, silent skull, how do you actually know the external object matches your internal perception?
Oh, wow. So the implication there is that the apple, exactly as I experience it, might not actually exist outside of my head.
Exactly. If your brain is the thing painting the picture based on invisible wavelengths,
yeah,
you could essentially be hallucinating a version of reality.
That is wild to think about.
It is. And that is the exact boundary line between science and philosophy. The physiologist explains the biological pathway. But the philosopher asks the bigger question. Does the apple actually exist the way I see it, or is it a complete construct?
Because science cannot prove objectivity from within a subjective biological system.
Right. And al-Waili notes that simply asking that question forces us to divide into philosophical camps just to make sense of the scientific data.
Yeah, let me try to break down those camps based on the text because it's super helpful. So if I assume that the color, the taste, and the texture are entirely generated by my mind, and the physical object might not even really exist, I fall into the idealist camp. But on the opposite end, if I believe my brain is just a passive receiver, like a camera taking a perfectly accurate, objective photograph of the apple, then I am a positivist.
Exactly. But both of those extremes have pretty massive limitations, which leads to the third major camp, the critics.
The critics, right?
Yeah, most notably represented by Immanuel Kant. The critical view argues for a synthesis of those two extremes.
So in Kant's view, it would be almost similar to wearing permanently tinted glasses. The external world, the actual reality of the apple, provides the light, which is the raw data.
Right, the stimulus.
Yeah, but your mind is the tinted glass that provides the color, the shape, and the structure. So you can never actually see the raw data without the tint of your own mind.
That is a perfect analogy. The critic argues that reality provides the stimulus, but human consciousness imposes the framework. Space, time, sensory qualities. That's all us.
So the scientific data about light waves and neural pathways is incredibly valuable, but it is merely the starting point.
Yes. Science measures the light, but philosophy determines the nature of the reality we are actually experiencing.
Okay, so if our brain is constructing this internal image of the apple, the immediate question that follows for me is, well, who or what is actually observing that image?
And now you are moving from the external world into the internal world of the human mind.
Right. Which brings us to Al-Majidi's next claim. He claimed that modern psychology had completely replaced the philosophy of human nature.
Yeah, and al-Waili tackles this by looking at the absolute pioneers of psychology. Guys like Freud, Adler, Jung, and Pavlov.
The heavy hitters.
Exactly. And he doesn't dismiss them. He acknowledges that they successfully mapped the behaviors of the conscious and subconscious mind. They categorized neuroses, they analyzed dreams, mapped out behavioral conditioning, but they were fundamentally restricted to observing outputs and behaviors.
It's like comparing psychology to a master mechanic diagnosing a car engine.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, like Freud and Pavlov can tell you exactly how the fuel injector works, why the engine is stalling, and how the gears shift. But philosophy is asking a completely different question. Who is driving the car, and where are they trying to go?
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. Take Pavlov, for instance. He can demonstrate how to condition a dog to salivate at the sound of a bell, right?
Right, by wiring a biological reflex to an outside stimulus.
Exactly. But behavioral conditioning does not explain the origin of consciousness itself. Al-Waili argues that the philosophy of psychology searches for the actual source of life, and he defines life through two really essential components.
Will and perception.
Yeah.
Let's explore those too, because the text makes a really sharp distinction between just biological movement and actual life.
So Al-Waili defines will as the innate ability to request something or reject something. It's your agency.
Okay.
But will cannot exist in a vacuum. You must have perception, meaning you have to actually know what you are requesting or rejecting. If you lack either will or perception, you do not have life.
You just have dead matter reacting to physical forces.
Exactly.
And the imagery he uses to illustrate this is so striking. He states that any movement not driven by will is just like a feather caught in the wind.
Yes, the feather analogy.
A feather has movement, right? It reacts to gravity, to air pressure, but it has no agency. It isn't alive. Science can track that feather's trajectory with perfect mathematical precision, but it cannot explain how a collection of atoms suddenly develops the will to change its own course.
And that's where psychologists often get bogged down. They get stuck in the minutia of categorizing instincts and emotions, mapping the engine, to use your analogy. But Al-Waili points out they suffer from an ignorance regarding the actual source of the will.
Right, because if we are ultimately just made of atoms and molecules, which are inherently dead matter, at what point does that dead matter wake up and decide it wants a cup of coffee?
Right. How does chemistry transform into desire?
The functional MRI can show the electrical spark in your brain when you make a decision, but it can't weigh or measure the desire itself. It just captures the shadow of the thought, not the substance.
Because the origin of consciousness sits entirely outside the jurisdiction of the scientific method. Psychology catalogs the behaviors of the mind, sure, but philosophy interrogates the fundamental nature of the mind's existence.
Okay, so we see science hitting a wall when exploring the inner limits of the mind. Let's push this outward. Let's look at the absolute outer limits of the cosmos.
The realm of physics.
Yeah, physics is the heavyweight discipline that supposedly took over ontology, right? The study of existence. So what happens when physicists reach the edge of their map?
Well, al-Waili tracks the ontological progression of physics to show exactly where that boundary lies. Physicists began by studying solid matter. Then, over time, they developed the tools to break that matter down into atoms.
Right.
Then, they smashed those atoms to find subatomic particles. And eventually, they reached the level of photons, the fundamental units of light.
They just keep zooming in and zooming in until the picture fundamentally changes. Because at the photon level, we aren't really dealing with solid stuff anymore, are we?
No, the material universe essentially dissolves at that point. A photon has no rest mass. At that subatomic frontier, solid matter just evaporates into a pure exchange of energy and probability waves. The physical trail goes completely cold.
Because there are no more physical properties left to measure.
Exactly.
Which forces physics into this ultimate chicken and egg scenario. If the material universe breaks down into pure energy, which came first? Did matter create the energy, or did the energy create the matter?
Right, and most physicists trace the expansion of the universe back to a singularity, a point of infinite density and pure energy.
The Big Bang.
The Big Bang. And that is exactly where the discipline of physics stops. That is the hard limit of their methodology. They can mathematically model the expansion of that energy from a fraction of a second after the event, but they absolutely cannot look before it.
Because time and space as measurable constructs didn't even exist yet.
Right.
So the physicist essentially has to put down the chalk. But the philosopher looks at that initial burst of energy and asks the question that physics is entirely unequipped to answer. Why is there something rather than nothing?
And al-Waili observes that the exact moment a physicist looks at the Big Bang and begins to ask questions about the initial cause of existence or what initiated that energy, they are no longer doing physics.
They've crossed the line.
They have. They've stepped off the map of the observable universe and have actually become a philosopher. Science measures the multiple, visible phenomena of the universe, but philosophy seeks the single hidden reality behind it all.
That's fascinating.
It is. And al-Waili connects this to the Quranic idea of unity, the concept that existence has an apparent outer layer and a hidden inner truth, a first cause and a last conclusion.
So science is the tool for cataloging the apparent, while philosophy is the tool for investigating the hidden. Okay, so if one discipline is always hitting a wall and the other discipline picks up the baton, how does al-Waili define their ongoing relationship? Because they obviously have to coexist.
He uses two really beautiful, very specific analogies in the text that clarify how scientists and philosophers should interact. The first is the tree analogy.
Right.
So he references the idea that philosophy begins where science ends. He compares the entire enterprise of science to the visible parts of a tree: the trunk, the branches, the leaves, the fruit.
So those represent disciplines like chemistry, biology, astronomy.
Exactly. They are visible, they can be measured, categorized, harvested.
But the visible parts of the tree rely entirely on a network that operates in the dark.
The roots. Philosophy represents the hidden roots beneath the soil. Those roots give the tree its stability, its nourishment, its actual life. You can't see them, but the tree dies without them.
And if a scientist decides to dig into the dirt to examine the origin of the tree, they enter the realm of philosophy.
Yes, and al-Waili adds a really fascinating caveat to this. He states that if one of those hidden philosophical roots is pulled up out of the ground, exposed to the light, and actually becomes measurable, it ceases to be philosophy.
It just becomes a new science.
Exactly. When early philosophers hypothesized about the composition of matter, that was philosophy. When we eventually built microscopes and split the atom, it became physics.
So philosophy is literally the discipline that births the sciences.
Yes, he calls it the sultana of sciences. It implies this continuous generation of knowledge. Philosophy ventures into the dark soil of the unknown, establishes a conceptual root system, and eventually science catches up, pulls that root to the surface, and a new branch of measurable data grows.
That is a beautiful way to look at it, but it also creates a pretty daunting requirement for the philosopher, doesn't it?
How do you mean?
Well, if philosophy is the mother of quantum mechanics and neurobiology and astrophysics, does a philosopher need a PhD in every single scientific discipline to do their job effectively? The sheer volume of modern data makes that literally impossible.
Right. And al-Waili addresses that exact logistical problem with his second metaphor, the bee analogy.
Okay, walk us through that one.
He argues that a philosopher absolutely does not need to be a microscopic specialist. They don't need to memorize the complex mathematical equations of string theory or the precise chemical makeup of a specific neurotransmitter.
So the philosopher doesn't need to know how to build the engine, just how to interpret the diagnostic report.
Precisely. Al-Waili compares the philosopher to a bee flying through a garden. The various scientific disciplines are the different flowers, and the philosopher visits these flowers and extracts only the nectar,
And the nectar represents what?
the ultimate, final conclusions that the specialists have reached. The philosopher takes the boundary-pushing discoveries of the physicist, the psychological patterns observed by the therapist, the historical data gathered by the anthropologist.
They just gather the what and the how from the experts.
Right, they gather that scientific nectar, internalize it, and apply their own logic, intuition, and inspiration. And through that internal synthesis, they produce honey. And the honey represents a completely new, comprehensive philosophical framework. It's a unified theory of existence that takes all these isolated data points from the various sciences and connects them into a coherent understanding of reality.
You know, the implications of that analogy extend far beyond just academic philosophy.
Oh, for sure.
For you, the listener, navigating the modern world, the daily influx of new studies, data points, and technological breakthroughs can be paralyzing. It is so easy to feel crushed by information overload.
Oh, absolutely.
But al-Waili's framework offers a way out of that paralysis. You don't need to memorize every fact or master every field. You only need to adopt the method of the bee. You extract the core takeaways from the information you encounter, and you synthesize it to refine your own understanding of the bigger picture.
It completely shifts the objective of learning. The goal is no longer the rote memorization of infinite data points, which, let's be honest, science and computers handle perfectly well. The goal is the pursuit of wisdom through synthesis.
So when we look back at Khazal al-Majidi's claim that modern science carved up philosophy's territory and left it extinct, al-Waili's defense really proves that science only managed to map the physical mechanisms.
Right.
Science tracks the light waves bouncing off the apple, it conditions the behavioral responses of the brain, and it traces the expansion of photons from the Big Bang. But philosophy evaluates the illusion of perception. It hunts for the origin of the will that animates human consciousness.
And it questions the uncaused cause of the universe.
Exactly. Science meticulously catalogs the visible tree, but philosophy remains the sultana of sciences, continually pushing roots deeper into the dark.
And that framework leaves us with a really compelling final consideration to think about.
What's that?
Well, if science represents the visible branches and philosophy represents the hidden roots searching through the unknown, we have to consider the trajectory of human technological advancement. If, thousands of years from now, our instruments become so incredibly advanced that we actually manage to dig up and expose every single root, if science eventually discovers the exact mechanistic origin of the universe's first spark of energy and the precise biological origin of human will there be any dark soil left for philosophy to explore?
Wow.
Or is the nature of existence structured in such a way that the philosophical tree simply grows endlessly, with roots that forever push deeper into an infinite unknown?
That forces a complete reevaluation of how we view certainty. The next time you encounter a perfectly mapped scientific study or see an incredibly detailed image from a deep space telescope, keep in mind that you are only looking at the leaves. The mechanism is visible, but the ultimate mystery driving it is still underground. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the work of Abdul Jabbar Al-Waily. Keep asking the big questions.